You know that feeling when someone says something that ruins your entire day? What if I told you that feeling only lasts 90 seconds unless you keep feeding it? Here's the truth. Most of your suffering isn't caused by what they did. It's caused by your refusal to let it go. You rehearse the insult. You replay the scene. You turn a single moment into a prison sentence. And the worst part is, you hold the key. Why does one careless comment burn in your mind for hours? Why does silence from someone else tear you open like betrayal? Because you've trained your mind to react, not reflect. And while you're busy being offended, the people who triggered you move on, untouched, unaware. The Stoics knew this trap well. If you're tired of being emotionally hijacked by things that don't deserve your peace, this video will challenge everything you think you know about anger, offense, and control. If you believe your inner world deserves more mastery than chaos, please subscribe. For the part of you that's ready to outgrow the noise, that's ready to choose calm, not because life gets easier, but because you get stronger. They say the first cut is the deepest, but the truth is, it's the second, third, and fourth that really do the damage. The first moment of anger is just a spark. Biologically, it's a surge of chemicals, your body's ancient alarm system reacting to a perceived threat. But what you do after that determines everything. Most people don't just feel the anger. They feed it. They nurse it like a wound, replaying that rude comment over and over again in their heads until it becomes a full-blown narrative. They imagine what they should have said, how they should have responded, what they'll say next time. And in doing that, they're not just reliving the offense, they're re-injuring themselves, over and over. It's like getting stung by a bee and then stinging yourself again on purpose for the next 6 hours. But here's what neuroscience and the Stoics tell us. That initial physiological surge of anger lasts about 90 seconds, just 90. After that, everything else is mental rehearsal, emotional addiction, the choice to hold on. And that's where power comes in, because if it's a choice, then it can be unchosen. Seneca once said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." He didn't say suppression. He didn't say ignore it or pretend it's not there. He said delay, give it space. Because what lives in that space is clarity. Reaction wants immediacy. It wants you to act now, to yell now, to escalate now. But if you give yourself even a breath, a pause between the flame and your first word, what you'll find is that most of the heat dies down all on its own. You'll see the difference between the event and the story you were beginning to build around it. You'll see how easily you were about to give your peace away to something temporary and meaningless. There's a quiet kind of wisdom in that pause, a strength most people never touch because they've convinced themselves that anger is strength, that volume equals power. But those are illusions. Real strength is restraint, not out of fear but out of principle. The Stoics didn't just aim to control anger, they aimed to be immune to it. Not in a robotic way, but in a deeply human way. They believed that emotion should be a servant to reason, not the other way around. So when something upsets you, the goal isn't to feel nothing. The goal is to feel everything, but respond like someone who owns themselves. And owning yourself starts with understanding that emotions are just signals, not orders. They pass, if you let them. The problem is that we rarely do. We cling to them. We assign meaning to them. We say, "I'm still angry because what they did was wrong." But the reality is, what they did was a moment. What you're still doing is a decision. And that distinction, that tiny shift in awareness, is everything. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And maybe that's the real opportunity in anger, not to express it, but to examine it, to ask, why did this hit me so hard? What part of me was touched that I haven't fully looked at yet? Because anger is rarely about the surface. It's rarely about what was said or done. It's about the meaning you gave it and what that meaning says about what you still carry. A wound, a belief, an old narrative that never really healed. So instead of fanning the fire, what if you sat with it, observed it, let it teach you instead of burn you? Epictetus reminded us, it is not events that disturb us, but our judgment about them. That quote should echo in your mind every time your chest tightens with rage, every time your fists clench and your thoughts race, because that's the moment, that's the choice point. You can give your power to the judgment, or you can return to the event itself, stripped of all the meaning you've layered on top of it. Most things, when reduced to their basic facts, aren't worth the emotional charge we give them. A delayed response, a missed message, a tone of voice. These aren't weapons unless you decide to be wounded. So when it comes, when that surge of heat rises in your chest, remember this: if you do nothing, it will pass. If you wait, if you breathe, if you choose not to add fuel, it dies on its own. 90 seconds. That's all it takes. Not to fix the world, not to change them, but to return to yourself, to hold the line. And in that act, in that simple refusal to lose yourself over something you cannot control, you become something rare. Not reactive, not emotionally hijacked, but anchored, still, strong, stoic. It's easy to say someone else is the problem, that their words, their tone, their actions are the reason you feel hurt, angry, disrespected. It's easy because it's instinctive. We look outside for the cause of our discomfort because that's where the trigger seems to live. But the truth is far less convenient and far more liberating. They didn't create the button, they just found it. The button was already there, built by years of experiences, beliefs, and emotional scars you haven't fully examined. When someone says something that hits you hard, it's not because they're powerful. It's because you've unknowingly given them access to something sensitive, something unhealed. That sarcastic joke or passive jab only stings because it brushed against a bruise that already existed. A bruise from being dismissed in the past. A bruise from not feeling seen. The reaction belongs to you. And that's not an accusation. It's an invitation. Because if the pain is yours, then so is the power to change it. We go through life thinking we're walking around with a remote control in someone else's hand, that they press and we react. But that's only true if the connection is active. Cut the connection and they press all they want. Nothing happens. Marcus Aurelius put it clearly, if you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your estimate of it. What he was getting at is radical ownership, not for blame, but for freedom. You can't stop people from being who they are. You can't control what they say, but you can control the meaning you give it, the narrative you build around it. And that narrative is where all your suffering or your peace lives. When someone pushes your buttons, the natural response is to retaliate or shut down. But what if instead you got curious? What if instead of saying, "They made me feel this way," you asked, "Why does this affect me so much?" That question doesn't just change the moment, it changes your entire relationship with pain. You stop being the passive recipient of emotional damage and start becoming the investigator of your own triggers. That doesn't make the other person right. It just makes you responsible for your inner world. And that's a responsibility that leads to emotional strength. Because no one can push what you've healed. No one can hurt what you've outgrown. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's what your buttons are. They're unconscious programs, built in childhood, reinforced by past wounds, and rarely questioned, until now. When you make them conscious, you take back the remote. You're no longer reacting from old pain, you're responding from present awareness. And that awareness is power. It's the space between the stimulus and your response. It's the ability to look at someone's behavior and say, "That's theirs, not mine." It's the capacity to hold your ground without getting pulled into the chaos they're trying to project. There will always be people who test your patience, who trigger old stories, who try to shake your balance. But those people are not in control of you. They never were. What's in control is your own interpretation of the moment, your own emotional history, your own unresolved pieces. And that's not a weakness, it's a map. Every time someone gets under your skin, they're showing you exactly where to look, exactly where to grow. Instead of seeing them as the enemy, what if you saw them as the mirror? Not a mirror of who you are, but a mirror of what still needs your attention. Epictetus said, "Any person capable of angering you becomes your master. He can anger you only when you permit yourself to be disturbed by him." That's the core of it. Emotional freedom begins when you stop handing out the keys to your peace. It begins when you stop letting people live rent-free in your mind. When you realize that being offended isn't a reflex, it's a decision, one that you can make differently. You can choose to pause, to observe, to respond with clarity instead of reactivity. There's no need to be hard or cold to do this. This isn't about building walls or pretending you don't care. It's about building boundaries, not around your heart, but around your interpretation. It's about realizing that your emotional life is yours to manage, not theirs to dictate. You can care about someone deeply and still not let their bad mood infect your own. You can disagree without letting it define your entire day. You can listen to criticism without letting it tear apart your sense of self. Seneca wrote, "He who is angry at the things which happen is like a dog barking at a stone." That's what it feels like when you keep blaming others for what you're feeling. Like barking at something that will never change, never respond, never give you peace. The work, the real work, is internal. It's in understanding that emotional mastery isn't about getting others to stop pressing your buttons. It's about disarming them altogether. You don't need to become indifferent to stop being reactive. You just need to become aware. Awareness creates distance, and distance gives you room to choose. That moment between being triggered and choosing your reaction, that's the moment where power lives. That's where you take the remote back into your own hands, not to mute the world, but to master your own volume, to decide how loud you want other people's noise to be inside your own mind. And the more you practice that, the quieter it becomes, the less they push, because eventually there's nothing left to push. The peace you're looking for isn't out there. It's in here, in the silent space between stimulus and response. In the simple act of not giving away control, in realizing that your buttons are not who you are. They are who you've been, and once you see them clearly, you can start becoming someone new. Someone who doesn't just talk about peace, but lives it. Quietly, consistently, powerfully, stoically. Anger feels powerful. It surges through the body like fire, hot, fast, blinding. In the moment, it makes you feel alive, strong, untouchable. It convinces you that you're in control, that you're standing your ground, that you're not the one being hurt, you're the one doing the hurting. But most of the time that's just the surface. That's the mask. Underneath all that heat is something much colder, much quieter, and far more vulnerable. The anger that erupts isn't usually the original emotion. It's a defense. A cover, a shield for something that feels too raw to expose. And the truth is, the more reactive your anger is, the more likely it's hiding something you don't want to face. Think about the last time you snapped at someone. Maybe it was a comment that caught you off guard, or a tone that felt disrespectful. But if you slow the moment down and strip it to its essence, there's often something deeper buried beneath that outburst. Maybe it wasn't disrespect. It was rejection. Maybe it wasn't just annoyance. It was fear of being misunderstood. When we explode in anger, we rarely ask ourselves, what am I actually protecting right now? Because it's easier to be angry than it is to be vulnerable. It's easier to raise your voice than to admit that something pierced your sense of worth. But if you look closely, that's what most anger is, a desperate attempt to avoid feeling the more painful emotion underneath. Irritation is often the surface-level cousin of something more important. When someone criticizes you, it may sting because it echoes a voice you've already internalized. Maybe it sounds like a parent who was never satisfied, a teacher who always pointed out your flaws, a partner who made you question your value. These echoes live inside us, and when someone triggers them, we don't always recognize the original source. Instead, we snap at the messenger. The anger isn't about them, it's about everything that came before them. The moment touches a bruise we never truly healed. And instead of feeling the pain, we turn it outward. That's why Stoicism doesn't ask us to suppress emotion. It asks us to examine it, to slow it down, to get underneath it. Because once you understand what's fueling your anger, you're no longer ruled by it. You don't have to act from it. You can sit with it, learn from it, and choose a better response. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you are offended at any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings. Then you will forget your anger." That's not about blame, it's about understanding. It's about realizing that most of our anger is less about justice and more about personal pain. And the longer we wear that mask of rage, the more disconnected we become from the truth inside us. The irony is that the more we pretend anger makes us strong, the more fragile we actually become. Because if you need anger to feel powerful, then your power is dependent on being provoked. And that means you're not in control at all. True strength doesn't come from being reactive. It comes from clarity, from knowing exactly what you're feeling and why, from having the self-awareness to say, I'm not angry because of what they said. I'm angry because it reminded me of something I haven't dealt with yet. That level of honesty is rare, but it's the kind that transforms you, not just in the moment, but in your life. Epictetus once said, if someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. That can be hard to accept, because it shifts the responsibility back to you. But that's where your power lives. In the space where you stop blaming and start investigating. That's the beginning of emotional freedom. Not just freedom from others, but freedom from the unconscious patterns that keep repeating themselves through you. The patterns that make you feel like you're always being attacked when really you're just always being reminded. Seneca, too, warned against trusting the first wave of emotion. He wrote, anger, if not restrained, is frequently more hurtful to us than the injury that provokes it. And you can feel this in your own life. How many times have you reacted in anger only to regret what you said or did later? How often has your response done more damage than the original offense? That's the cost of unexamined emotion. That's what happens when we let the mask do the talking instead of facing what's underneath. But once you see anger for what it truly is, a messenger, not a master, you can approach it differently. You can meet it with curiosity instead of fear. You can pause and ask, what's really going on inside me right now? That pause is everything. It interrupts the automatic pattern. It gives you a moment to choose instead of react. And every time you make that choice, you chip away at the illusion that you are your anger. You're not. You're the one watching it rise and fall. You're the one deciding what to do next. Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And in the realm of emotion, that couldn't be more true. If you never question your reactions, you'll live your whole life being pulled by them, controlled by them, defined by them. But if you look beneath the mask, you'll find a deeper truth, one that doesn't need to yell, one that doesn't need to defend, one that simply understands, and in understanding becomes unshakable. Anger will still come. You're human. You feel. You care. But it doesn't have to own you. It doesn't have to wear your face and speak in your voice. It can arrive, and you can let it pass, like a wave you see rising on the horizon. You don't have to fight it. You just have to stand still long enough to let it wash over without knocking you down. That's the way of the Stoic. Not to be emotionless, but to be masterful. To feel everything, and still respond with intention. That's not weakness. That's not avoidance. That's the kind of power that doesn't need to be loud to be real. And the more you practice it, the less you'll need the mask. Because what's underneath isn't weakness, it's truth. And truth, when faced with courage, is stronger than any fire. Most people live as if their reactions are automatic, like lightning after thunder. Something happens, and without thinking, they snap, lash out, shut down, or spiral. It's so quick, so familiar, that it doesn't even feel like a choice. But it is, always. Between what happens and what you do about it, there's a sliver of silence, an invisible space, and inside that space is everything, your peace, your clarity, your power. But most people never find it, not because it's hidden, but because they've never looked for it. Life rushes them past that moment. Emotion hijacks them before they realize they've crossed the line between awareness and reaction. Yet that fleeting pause is the only place where real freedom exists. When someone cuts you off in conversation, when your partner says something insensitive, when a stranger gives you a dirty look, your body will react. Your heart rate may rise. Your breath may shorten. A flood of emotion might surge into your chest. But what happens next is entirely up to you. You can fire back, or you can wait. You can let your instinct run the show, or you can let your intention take the wheel. That choice happens in a blink, and if you miss it, you end up saying things you don't mean, doing things you later regret, and wondering how you lost your grip on yourself again. But if you find it, if you learn to step into that space, it changes everything. Because that's where you stop reacting like a puppet and start responding like a person with agency. Viktor Frankl, a man who endured unthinkable suffering in Nazi concentration camps, once wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose." He didn't say that space would always feel comfortable, or obvious, or easy to reach, but it's always there, and the more you practice noticing it, the larger it gets. What begins as half a second becomes a full breath, then two, then a pause long enough to reframe the entire situation. That angry text you were about to send suddenly doesn't feel necessary. That defensive comment you were preparing doesn't sound so wise, and without doing anything else, you just changed your entire trajectory by doing nothing at all. The Stoics called this mastery of the self, not a cold detachment, but a clear refusal to be ruled by impulse. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's the reminder we all need, because most people live like they have no power over anything, as if emotions are facts and reactions are destiny. But the moment you step into that pause, you realize you're not bound by the chain of events. You can break the link. You can choose a different response than the one your anger, fear, or pride demands. And that choice, over and over again, is what builds character. It's easy to misunderstand this, to think that restraint means weakness, that walking away means surrender. But in truth, it's the opposite. The strongest people are not the ones who yell the loudest or strike back the fastest. They're the ones who can sit in the heat of emotion and not let it control their hands or their words. They're the ones who can be insulted and still remain composed, because they've trained themselves to return to that space between trigger and response. They don't react out of ego, they respond out of principle, and in doing so, they become the calm in the storm, the unmoved in the chaos. Carl Jung once said, "What we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate." That unconscious pull to react instantly, to meet aggression with aggression, isn't fate, it's habit. And habits can be changed. But first, they must be seen. That's why the pause matters so much. It interrupts the autopilot. It gives you the chance to make something conscious, to ask, what story am I telling myself right now? Because your reaction doesn't come from the situation itself, it comes from the meaning you assign to it. A harsh tone becomes disrespect, a delayed reply becomes rejection, a disagreement becomes betrayal. But those are stories, and you get to edit the script. That's what the pause gives you, a seat in the writer's chair. Epictetus taught that no one can harm you without your consent, that the insult isn't in the words, it's in how you receive them. And this isn't just theory, you felt it before. Think of a time when someone tried to provoke you, and it didn't work. Not because they were kind, but because you were grounded. You were present enough to pause, to see through their words and stay steady in yourself. That wasn't luck. That was you accessing your space. That was self-control, dressed in stillness. It doesn't mean you'll get it perfect every time. You'll still have moments where emotion slips past you, where the reaction comes too fast and leaves you wishing you'd handled it differently. That's part of the practice. But even in those moments you can learn, you can reflect, you can ask, where was the space, and what kept me from it? The more you do that, the sharper your awareness becomes. You start to see the wave before it crashes. You feel the urge to respond too quickly, and remember, you don't have to. Seneca once wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." And in many ways, the space between trigger and response is where that adversity lives, not in the external world, but in the internal one. The challenge isn't what happens, it's what happens inside you, and the response you choose is the proof of your growth. It's where you show yourself who you're becoming. There will always be noise, always pressure, always people who test your patience, challenge your ego, stir up old wounds. But they don't own the script. You do. And the more you practice stepping into that pause, the more you reclaim your role as the author. One breath, one heartbeat, one space between stimulus and response. That's all it takes to become untouchable. Not because nothing can reach you, but because you've learned how to meet it all with presence, with poise, with power. And in that moment, you don't just respond differently. Anger only has the power to take over when you believe that it's you, that it's who you are. But you are not your anger. You're not your frustration, your anxiety, your sadness, or your fear. You are the one who experiences those things, not the things themselves. That's a massive difference, and it's the reason why some people can walk through chaos with calm, while others get knocked over by every breeze. Most people get swept away because they've never learned to separate themselves from what they're feeling. They don't know how to witness the storm without stepping into it. But once you understand that your awareness is always bigger than the emotion inside it, you step into a new kind of power, one that doesn't need to fight the feeling because it knows it's not the feeling. When anger starts to rise, when your jaw tightens, your chest tightens, your breathing shifts, your first instinct is often to follow it, to do something, to say something. But what if you didn't? What if instead of obeying that emotion, you just noticed it? You observed the heat without feeding it. You watched it rise and then watched it fall. That shift, as small as it sounds, is everything. It's the difference between being trapped and being free. Because emotions are temporary, They come and go. But the observer in you, the one who sees it all, that's the constant. That's the anchor. The sky doesn't rage when the clouds pass through. It just remains still and open, letting whatever needs to pass. You're like that. You don't have to scream just because something is screaming inside you. You don't have to react just because the emotion wants you to. You can pause. You can breathe. You can say, I notice I'm feeling this, without being consumed by it. And that subtle shift from identification to observation is where calm is born. Not because life suddenly gets easier, but because you're no longer mistaking the weather for the sky. Carl Jung believed that the ability to observe oneself is the foundation of psychological growth. He once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." And awakening, in this sense, is about becoming conscious of your own patterns, seeing them play out in real time and saying, I don't need to follow this one again. That's what being the observer is. It's not detachment in the cold sense. It's compassionate distance, a willingness to witness your own emotional waves without getting dragged under by them. And that ability is not just powerful, it's peaceful. It's not that you stop caring, it's that you stop being owned by what you care about. You start responding to life from a place of center, instead of letting every outside situation pull you off balance. And you can feel the difference. You know when you're caught in the emotion, and you know when you're just watching it. One feels frantic and loud, the other feels spacious and quiet. When you're the observer, nothing owns you, not even the strongest emotion. You become like a mountain, still and grounded, even as the wind howls around you. But make no mistake, this takes practice. It doesn't come from reading a quote or watching a video. It comes from noticing the moments when your body tenses, when your thoughts race, and then making the conscious decision to watch instead of react. That practice builds muscle, emotional muscle, and eventually what used to overwhelm you becomes just another wave in the ocean. You stop fearing it. You stop needing to control it. You just let it move through. And in doing so, you find a freedom that no reaction could ever give you. Seneca said, "A wise man is indifferent to everything which he cannot control, and emotions, while they arise naturally, only control you if you don't recognize them for what they are. Thoughts with energy, sensations with stories, but not permanent, not truths, and certainly not who you are. The wise man doesn't repress what he feels, he just doesn't mistake it for reality. He holds space for it. He lets it visit, but doesn't let it take over the house." The more you develop this relationship with your emotions, this gentle witnessing, the less you need to fight them. You don't have to suppress, argue, or run. You just become still, and in that stillness, everything shifts. You become less reactive, more present, less chaotic, more clear. And people will notice it, not because you tell them, but because they'll feel it, in the way you move, the way you speak, the way you respond when others lose control. You become the calm one, the one who doesn't rise with every tide. This isn't some ideal you'll reach perfectly. There will be days where you fall into old patterns. But the difference is, now you'll see it. You'll catch it faster. And the more you catch it, the more you'll realize you were never the anger. You were never the anxiety. You were never the reaction. You were always the one watching, the one choosing, the one holding space for something more powerful than noise, awareness. So the next time you feel that rush of emotion building, remember, you don't have to become it. You can just be with it, observe it, let it rise, let it fall, and trust that your stillness will outlast the storm, because it always does. Most of us spend our lives trying to avoid difficult people. We wish they would just disappear. The boss who micromanages every task, the family member who interrupts before we finish a sentence, the stranger who cuts us off and doesn't apologize. It's natural to see them as obstacles to peace, as irritants we have to endure until they leave us alone. But what if they're not in your way at all? What if they are the way? That's not just a comforting idea, it's a radical shift in how you view your emotional world. Because once you stop resisting them and start studying them, you begin to see what the Stoics saw. They're not breaking you, they're building you. Every moment of frustration is a moment of training your restraint, your clarity, your grace under fire. Think of those people like emotional weights. When you're trying to grow muscle, you don't complain about the barbell, you don't curse the weight for being heavy, you lift it precisely because it challenges you. It's the tension that triggers growth. The same applies to the people who get under your skin. They reveal where you're still reactive, where your ego still clings to control, where your inner world can still be shaken. And instead of resenting them for that, what if you used them? What if you let them show you the very areas you still need to strengthen? Epictetus once said, "Difficulties show men what they are." He didn't say they make you weak. He didn't say they're unfair. He said they reveal you. That's what the world does. It reveals your conditioning, not through silence and comfort, but through discomfort and resistance. The person who annoys you most is your mirror, not your enemy. They reflect the parts of you that still need your attention. If someone's tone instantly offends you, maybe it's not just their tone, it's your sensitivity to being dismissed. If someone's control makes you defensive, maybe it's not just about control, it's about your discomfort with not being trusted. The specifics don't matter as much as your willingness to investigate them. The real test isn't in changing them, it's in watching how you show up in their presence. And this is where the work begins. Not by fixing them, but by noticing your internal reaction when they walk in the room. Do your shoulders tense? Does your breath quicken? Does your mind rehearse a conflict that hasn't even happened yet? All of those are signals, and they don't belong to them. They belong to you. That's the gold. The more aware you become of your internal reactions, the more power you have to change your external responses, and the more that gap widens, the more you'll feel something that looks a lot like peace, not because the world changed, but because you did. When someone disrespects you, you get to explore what respect really means to you. When someone belittles you, you get to revisit old wounds that haven't fully closed. You get to sit with yourself and say, why does this matter so much to me? Not in a self-critical way, but in a curious, compassionate one. The truth is, most of the people who bother us aren't trying to ruin our lives. They're just living theirs, imperfectly, like we all are. The problem isn't that they exist. The problem is that we expect them to be anything other than what they are. The Stoics trained themselves to expect the worst in people, not to become cynical, but to remain calm. If you expect people to be thoughtless, rude, or impatient from time to time, you're not thrown off when it happens. You don't take it personally. You say, there it is, and then you return to your center. You remember that how they behave is their path. How you respond is yours. This isn't about moral superiority or spiritual bypassing. It's about maturity. It's about looking at every annoyance as resistance training for your soul, and the heavier it feels, the more it's asking you to grow. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again that people act according to their nature, that what they do is not up to you, but what you do is always your responsibility. That doesn't mean you have to stay in toxic situations or accept disrespect. Boundaries are still essential, but even boundaries are best set from a place of calm, not chaos, from clarity, not fury. That's what this inner work gives you, the ability to choose the right response, not the fastest one. And over time, those responses begin to shape who you are. Not just someone who talks about self-control, but someone who embodies it. Socrates once said, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle, and maybe the person you can't stand is dealing with stress you'll never know about. Maybe they're afraid, maybe they're lost, maybe they've never been shown another way. That doesn't excuse their behavior, but it can soften your need to punish them with your reaction. You don't have to match their energy. You don't have to prove a point. You don't even have to win. You just have to hold your ground. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is nothing at all. When you start seeing difficult people as teachers, not threats, the whole world becomes your classroom, and every uncomfortable moment becomes a chance to practice, not perform. Practice. You become a student of your own patterns, a guardian of your peace, a quiet force that doesn't need applause or validation. You become resilient, not through avoidance but through exposure, through testing, through steady, intentional response. And eventually, those same people who used to derail you become irrelevant to your emotional stability. They lose their power, not because they changed, but because you did. You reframed the story. You stopped being the victim and started being the student. And now you're learning every day, not from books, from life, from real people, from real tension, from the moments you used to hate and now use. This isn't the easy path. It's not the comfortable one, but it's the one that leads somewhere real, to strength, to self-respect, to peace that doesn't depend on anyone behaving a certain way. And if you can train yourself to meet resistance with stillness, to meet discomfort with insight, then even your enemies become your allies. Even the most annoying person in the room becomes your instructor, because the people who challenge your peace the most are the ones teaching you how to protect it. Most people wake up and walk straight into their day without any sense of what might set them off. They think their emotions are responses to the world, but really they're responses to wounds, some old, some fresh, all mostly unconscious. One offhand comment, a familiar tone, a look you've seen 1,000 times before, and suddenly you're not in the present moment anymore. You're spiraling, reacting, fighting ghosts that don't even belong to the person in front of you. And the saddest part is, most people don't even realize it's happening. They think someone made them angry, ruined their day, disrespected them. But all that really happened was a landmine got stepped on, a hidden trigger, something buried long ago, still active beneath the surface. We all have them. Words that instantly pierce, behaviors that make our blood pressure spike. But these landmines aren't random. They follow a pattern, a rhythm shaped by memory, pain, and meaning. The more personal it feels, the more likely it's connected to something that predates the moment. A raised voice may not just be loud, it might echo the tone of a parent who never listened. A sigh from a partner might not just be breath. It might carry the weight of a past relationship where you were constantly dismissed. But if you're not aware of these triggers, you'll react as if the present is always to blame. That's why awareness is everything. Not to shame yourself, not to label yourself as broken, but to finally understand what's going on inside, to know your own emotional landscape like a map. Where are the places you collapse? Where are the reactions that seem too big for the situation? That's where the gold is. That's where your growth lives. Because the goal isn't to avoid all conflict, to live wrapped in silence and distance. The goal is to walk through life with your eyes open, to see the landmines before you step on them. Epictetus once said, "People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them." And that includes the views we take of ourselves. When someone triggers you, it's easy to lash out or shut down. But what if you just paused and asked, what part of me was just touched? Not as a weapon against yourself, but as a door. What if that anger wasn't just about what was said, but about an old place in you that never felt protected? What if that sharp reaction wasn't the problem, but the signal that there's still something inside you calling out for understanding? Carl Jung talked often about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or ignore. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's what your triggers are. They're unconscious messages, disguised as sudden emotional explosions, and the more often you're caught off guard, the more you know there's still something you haven't looked at. But that's not a curse. That's your work. That's your roadmap to freedom, because the more you understand the story behind the reaction, the less power it has over you. This isn't about perfection. You'll still get triggered sometimes. You'll still feel the pull of old reactions. But the difference is, you'll see it happening. You'll notice when a certain voice hits a nerve. You'll feel the build-up before the eruption. And in that awareness, you gain choice. Maybe you won't say the thing you always regret. Maybe you won't let your day be hijacked by someone else's behavior. Maybe, just maybe, you'll remember that not every provocation deserves your energy. Tracking your landmines isn't about becoming emotionally sterile. It's about becoming emotionally sovereign. It's about knowing yourself so deeply that nothing catches you off guard anymore. You're not cold. You're clear. You're not detached. You're directed. You know what hurts, why it hurts, and how to move with it instead of against it. That's the kind of maturity that changes relationships, that reshapes conversations, that protects your peace not by avoiding life, but by understanding your place in it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The nearer a man comes to a calm mind, the closer he is to strength. And there is no greater calm than walking into your day already aware of what might try to throw you off. Not paranoid, not anxious, just prepared. When you know your triggers, they lose their surprise. When you understand their origins, they lose their power. You stop blaming the outside world for every sharp edge and start taking responsibility for your own healing. And that's the heart of it, healing. Because triggers aren't just reactions. They're messages from parts of you that are still aching for your attention, not to be fixed immediately, not to be silenced, but to be seen. And once you see them clearly, you stop mistaking pain for identity. You stop letting reactions write your character. You start living from a place of intention, not emotional survival. So, as you go forward, don't just focus on the people who test your patience. Focus on why they do. Don't just notice what offends you. Notice what part of your history it touches. Pay attention to your nervous system, to the patterns of tension that show up in the same moments, again and again. That's your compass. That's the beginning of mastery. Because you wouldn't walk into a battlefield without knowing where the danger is. And your mind, your relationships, your days, they're full of moments that ask you to choose, react blindly, or respond wisely. The more you know yourself, the easier that choice becomes. And each time you choose awareness over impulse, calm over chaos, insight over injury, you're not just avoiding pain, you're building peace, one conscious moment at a time. There's a story we tell ourselves when we're tired of trying. We say, some people are just born calmer. We look at someone who stays composed under pressure, who doesn't raise their voice or take things personally, and we assume they must have something we don't. Better wiring, better parents, better luck. And with that story, we excuse ourselves. We give ourselves permission to stay reactive, to explode, to shut down. We label our outbursts as part of our personality. But here's the truth most people avoid. Calm is not a gift. It's a skill. And just like any skill, it's earned through practice. Think about it like training a muscle. Nobody walks into a gym for the first time and lifts the heaviest weight on the floor. They build, slowly, consistently. And emotional control is no different. Every time you take a breath instead of speaking from anger, Every time you sit with discomfort instead of projecting it onto someone else, you're building strength, not just mentally, but neurologically. You're rewiring yourself to respond with intention instead of habit, and those tiny choices, over and over, become who you are. But the process isn't glamorous. It's not a peaceful morning with incense burning and soft music playing. Sometimes it looks like biting your tongue when everything in you wants to snap. Sometimes it means walking away from an argument not because you're weak, but because you finally understand that peace is more valuable than winning. It means being the bigger person, even when no one notices, because this isn't about being seen, it's about being solid. Carl Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we refuse to confront become the very forces that rule us. And when it comes to emotional control, most people avoid the truth of their reactivity. They say things like, "That's just how I am," or "I can't help it." But that's not self-awareness. That's surrender. That's saying, "I'd rather stay the same than do the uncomfortable work of changing." But the uncomfortable work is where the transformation lives. That's where calm stops being a concept and becomes a practice. There's no timeline for this, no deadline to become unshakable. You don't need to be perfect to be peaceful. You just need to be practicing, to keep showing up to the moment with enough self-respect to not let it control you. Because every time you give yourself to anger or pettiness or defensiveness, you're handing your power over to something outside of you. And that's never where it belongs. There's this quiet dignity that comes with that kind of practice. It doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. In the way you respond when someone disrespects you. In the way you carry yourself through traffic, through conflict, through noise. People might not notice at first, but you will, and that's the point. Because peace isn't about their validation. It's about your alignment. But make no mistake, this practice isn't soft. It's not passive. It's powerful, because it means you're taking full responsibility for your inner state, not blaming, not outsourcing, not waiting for the world to be quieter so you can finally feel okay. You train yourself to be okay in spite of the noise. You become the one who brings calm into the room, instead of absorbing everyone else's chaos. And that kind of presence, that changes things. It starts small. You pause before responding. You take one deep breath when you want to lash out. You say no without guilt. You leave a conversation without needing the last word. These aren't giant acts of heroism, but over time they accumulate. They become a rhythm, a standard, a way of life. And the more you lean into that, the more you realize you don't need to be naturally calm. You just need to be committed to it. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And if that's true, then calm isn't a trait. It's a strategy. It's how you protect your energy, your clarity, your time. It's not a sign that you're unaffected. It's a sign that you've learned not to give everything access to your emotional space. That's not coldness. That's wisdom. So the next time someone says, "You're so calm," don't brush it off like a compliment you didn't earn. Own it. Not as a personality trait, but as the product of hours, days, and years spent training in silence. Because calm doesn't come from being born with better nerves. It comes from meeting yourself over and over in the tension and choosing who you want to be, even when it's hard. You don't wait for peace. You build it, one response at a time. You were never meant to be ruled by what angers you. You were meant to rise above it, not by force, but by understanding. Every moment you choose stillness over reaction, you reclaim yourself,